Today we're going to fly really low and fast over a book that you probably read you may have read many times, maybe not. But I don't want to start right into it because that would be too easy. I want to start out with something that maybe will look like it doesn't really even have anything to do with Job. So, there was you may have heard this, maybe not, but there was a Polish immigrant who went to the Wisconsin Department of Motor Vehicles and in Milwaukee to apply for a driver's license. And he was told he had to take an eye test. And the examiner showed him a card with these letters on it. He said, "Can you read this?" "Read it," the Polish guy said. "I know the guy." Now, what makes a joke funny? A joke is funny because it usually has an unexpected turn at the end. Now, unexpected turns can be funny, but unexpected turns can also be tragic. And I wanted to start off with something at least to make you laugh, because we probably won't laugh a lot through the rest of this, so I had to start off with something. How many of you remember the Sago mining disaster that happened in West Virginia, in Upshur County, 2nd of January of this year? It was during the early morning hours of January 2nd, an explosion occurred at the International Coal Group's Sago mine in that county, trapped 13 miners about 250 feet below the surface. And rescue efforts ensued, and about 37 hours into the ordeal, reports started circulating about the fate of the 13 coal miners. This hit every major newspaper in the country. It was front page news. They didn't know what happened to these guys. This lady's face was on the front page of hundreds of newspapers. Family and friends were dealt a heart-wrenching blow during the early morning hours of January 4th. They went in and they dug, and they dug. And the people there didn't know what was happening. The newspapers just, they were glued to this article, to this story, as these people prayed. And they prayed for their husbands and loved ones for that 44 hours. And then finally, toward the end of this period, about 11:48 on Wednesday night, news began spreading that they found one miner who was dead, and then they found that they had found 12 miners alive. And then for nearly 3 hours, the family and the local residents celebrated the news that 12 had survived, but company officials said they knew the information was wrong within 20 minutes of that news leaking out. And the families weren't informed of the miscommunication until nearly 3 hours later. And then they had to deal with pulling out the 12 men who were dead and one man who survived with tremendous injuries that he still hasn't completely recovered from, and they don't know if he ever will. One of the strangest things about this was what happened to the newspaper headlines. This happened just at the point when major newspapers all over the country were putting their final editions to bed. What happened was they had put it together that these men were alive and then found out that they were dead. The New York Times presses in Queens, New York and Edison, New Jersey had just finished their runs when the wires reported that only one miner had survived. With multiple editions running in plants from coast to coast, USA Today was able to get the updated report, but with a photo from the earlier moments of jubilation on the front page. The Los Angeles Times called back trucks. They had one story on it. They had to destroy 200,000 copies of the newspaper to print another one. The Rocky Mountain News had to print another copy. Same thing happened. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution had to call back their trucks as well. They actually put a different front page picture on it. Although the Chicago Tribune used the same picture, changed the front headline, and put a different story under it. Boston Globe destroyed 30,000 copies of their newspaper, but about 200,000 copies of the newspaper had already been delivered with the wrong story on it. This is the New York Daily News. See, they had two different front pages that day. Both of these were delivered. Charleston Gazette. Again. This one shows you, this isn't a story about Lindsay Lohan, who's on the front page here, but it shows you that the New York Post had two different copies, two different issues that went out that day, just because of the timing of this. This is a very, very tragic event, and it's the turn of just the circumstances and what happened, and just how that ripped people apart, just how that must have made them feel. As I was reading through these, I just couldn't help but just cry as you saw what these people had to deal with. It was awful, awful. Well, what's that got to do with Job? You know, it's got everything to do with Job. Job is a book it's really kind of foreign to most Christians, I think, even though those that have read it. I might even add those that have read it several times. The story and the plot are fairly easy to master. You know what happened. Even the methods of the writer of the book, they're not that hard to figure out. But if you ask about the message, what the author is trying to communicate and why the book is there in the first place, well, you can ask everybody in this room and you'll probably get somewhat of a different answer. Is it a book about human suffering? Or is it a book about the human condition? Is it a book about the necessity of man to accept the hand that's dealt him? Whatever it is. Is it a book about spiritual realities? What is it about? Is it a book about pain? Is it a book about, what is it? The questions go on. They build. Once we start down a path of questions, what's interesting about this one is, depending on how you start asking the questions, it kind of determines how you end up, where you end up. If you start wrong, you'll end up wrong. The paths seem to have predetermined course. Most of us, as it turns out, I think, bring our own baggage to Job. And we tend to want to dump it there and hope that we get answers to our own questions. And it just doesn't work that way. Job is a book that almost immediately presents us with some pretty difficult questions, I think. The interesting thing is that most of the significant questions in the book really come out in the first two chapters. That's the first prose section of the book. The book is divided up into two prose sections, the first two and the last two chapters, and the middle section of the book is all poetry. Surely there are life issues raised in the rest of the book. There are. But they're mostly corollary to those raised in the beginning. The book contains basic wisdom about life and death all through the book. That's true. Fortune and misfortune and how it works in practical terms for the God-fearing person. And it's no accident that God predates, that Job, that is, predates even the Torah as our written record of God's interaction with man. With an understanding of the principles found in this book, I really think that we are better equipped to handle the exceptional events that God places in our path. So what I want to do is show you just, well, before I do that, I want to ask you, how many of you have read it? Okay. Did you understand it? Okay. Yes. A lot of you just sitting there. Okay. I don't want to say anything. Okay. Is it just a little scary? I'm going to tell you why I asked that question in just a minute. Is it just a little intimidating? You'd be surprised. I taught through this book in about a year. It's a little intimidating to me to be standing up here doing it in less than 90 minutes, having done it in a year, because I feel like I can't possibly do it justice. But I've had several people come up to me and tell me they're almost afraid to read the book. Do you understand? Do you know? Can you figure out why? It's almost okay. Some of you understand why. They almost feel like if they read the book, something's going to happen. Something bad will happen, and I can understand that. It's one of these things, you know. If I read this book, God must be preparing me for something bad that's going to happen to me. So maybe if I just don't read it, it won't happen. So I don't want to read that book. And that's not the way it works, of course. Obviously, we know that in our head, but there's a difference between what we know sometimes and what we think. You know, it's just kind of these loose marbles that roll around. It's not really one of the things I want to say right here is Job is not really a book about suffering. It is in the context of suffering. The story is in that context, no question about it. It's a book about Job's faith and the trial he went through. The questions it answers deal much more with how the believer responds to God when trials come than they deal with why the trials come in the first place. That's a very, very important thing to remember. The fact that trials will come is a given. We're promised that we're going to have trials. Jesus Christ said, I came that I must suffer. We're promised that we will suffer, that if we're going to live godly in Christ Jesus, we will be persecuted, we will suffer. So, trials and suffering that's just part of life. So this is really not really, and the book doesn't really tell us why we suffer. It shows us how to live in the suffering. And for that reason, it's really no different than a lot of other books in Scripture. If you want to, you just look at 2 Timothy 3:12, Philippians 1:29, for you to have been granted what? To suffer for Christ's sake. You know, we've been promised that we're going to get to suffer. So don't think that if you're going to read Job or anything else like this, that it's going to bring on suffering. That's not what's going to bring it on. Okay, how are we going to go through this? What this is about. What are we going to do here? First thing we're going to do is we're going to just look at how Job presents some difficult theological and ethical questions. We've already kind of talked about that. It deals with questions regarding the relationship of the believer's faith to situations involving suffering and his approach to God during these times. Most of the questions raised in Job arise very early in the text, within the first 2 chapters of the book. And then we're going to endeavor to point out some of those issues and show how they are consistent with difficulties and crises that believers encounter today. And I can't possibly point out all the issues. There are a lot of sub-themes in Job. what I'm hoping to do is just point out a couple of the major ones, the primary ones. You can go through and find a lot of little sub themes that you can just trace around through the book. There are a lot of things that come up. It's a wisdom book after all. So, how are we going to do this? First, I'm going to look at the man and his circumstances. I'm going to start out primarily, I'm going to spend most of my time looking at Job 1 and 2. So what is this about this man? Then I want to spend a little bit of time and look at the character of the man, because this is really what the first two chapters emphasize. This is where the emphasis of the first two chapters is. It's the story, but primarily it emphasizes what the character of this person Job is. That's what makes him important. And then we'll spend a little bit of time at the end trying to resolve some of the issues. So, give you a short outline of those two chapters. Real simple. Round 1, chapter 1. Round 1, chapter 1. It breaks down really simply. There's an introduction to his character. It starts right off. And then, right after that, there's an example given. If you remember, it talks about his children and what they used to do. They used to do, periodically, they would have these feasts. And how at the very end of that little story about his children and having feasts, what it tells you is that he would have sacrifices in case one of them had cursed God. That whole section right there is given as an example of how godly this man is. Excuse me. And then what it does is it starts into a cycle. The first interaction between Yahweh and Satan is 6 through 12. And then Job's loss of property and family in that order. All those significances in the reverse order. That happens within a period of probably a few hours at the most. And then God's reaction to his loss, his godly reaction to his loss at the end of chapter 1. Then after some unspecified time, you get round 2. That's what chapter 2 is all about. And this is where the second interaction between Yahweh and Satan starts. And God gives Satan permission to attack Job physically. Job's godly reaction to his physical calamity in 2:8 through 10. And then at the very end of chapter 2, there's this little interesting thing. His 3 friends arrive to comfort Job. And actually, when his 3 friends arrive, it tells you who they are, where they come from, and what they do. And what they do is perfectly fine. They sit with him for 7 days and don't say a word, which is probably the best thing they do the whole book. So, and actually, Job tells them several times in the book that that's exactly what he wants them to do, is to sit with him. They don't listen. So, backing up to how we're going to go through this, the man and his circumstances. Now, this is just how the book works, how the first part of the book works. Even non-Christian even non-Christians admire the way this book is put together. It's very tight in a literary sense. It's good literature. It really is. It is so incredibly well written that it's just very, very. You can find it read in secular universities, and they'll tell you you should read it. It's very good literature. It is, nobody knows how old it is. It's very old. It's at least as old as the patriarchal times. It shows up again. There's a copy of it in Babylonian literature, but that's later. That's much later. That could be as 700 to 800 years later than it was actually written. But so it was a story that was well known in the Middle East. But this is the original. And so as the book opens, we find out some things about Job. And we kind of get a feeling that we know a little bit about him. But we kind of wonder, who is this guy? It kind of gives you just enough information to where you feel like you know something about him, but you kind of don't know who he is. It's one of these things that just kind of gives you just enough, but not quite enough. And you don't know exactly who he is. It tells you that he was it tells you basically he's an Eastern king. He's the most richest man in the East. You know that. You don't know exactly where. You don't know when. You don't know what kind of life he lived exactly. The text is just what I would call immensely compact and very purposeful. It only gives us information and details that will lead us in the direction that the author wants us to go. In other words, it's one of these, you ever seen one of these minimal information riddle kind of things where they only give you exactly the information that you need to solve the riddle? They're very frustrating. They're the kinds of things that somebody gives you this, they just can drive you up a wall that you just walk away from it and say, forget it. And that's what Job is. It gives you only the information you need to track with what he's going to tell you. And so basically, if he doesn't tell you, you don't need it. If he doesn't talk about it, he's not talking about that. So people are there, and events simply happen. It doesn't explain them. The author wants us to be satisfied with the information he's providing, but our discomfort with the subject matter compels us. It drives us to want to go beyond the limited information that's given. The first two chapters start out by telling a story, but the story quickly turns into that from which our worst nightmares are made. Questions fly through our minds almost uncontrollably as we try to deal with our vicarious shock, and we imagine the trauma that Mr. and Mrs. Job must have dealt with. To cap it all off, there's a spiritual dimension. What I call a deus ex machina in reverse is thrown into the mix as we see both the Lord Yahweh himself and Satan working behind the scenes to engineer a calamity without Job's knowledge or permission. And Job is completely unaware of any of this. It's really just a terrible situation all the way around for everybody involved. Many, many people die, apparently for no reason whatsoever. Job's 10 children are crushed when a house collapses. His servants are almost all killed in a matter of hours, possibly days, but I think hours. Job is ruined financially as his life work is destroyed. Then his health is attacked in a most vicious manner. His wife, who we must remember she's also an injured party in all this. She doesn't prove to be particularly helpful as a valued team member. Her only recorded comment to Job reveals her own despair, actually. And yet, what his response to her is actually what I would call a measured, gentle reply. He doesn't really go after her on that. But a lot of times people really say he really goes after her on that and calls her a foolish woman. He doesn't. He actually says, don't act like a foolish woman. He's really chastising her, but he's not being harsh on her. He knows that she's suffered as well. But basically, Job is left as an outcast. He goes from the top of the heap to the bottom of the heap. Matter of fact, he sits on the heap. The man who had been a ruler is reduced to ruin in just a matter of, less than a week? And the obvious question that we want to ask is what? Why? Well, that's because we're bringing our baggage to this story, and it doesn't deal with that. It just says, it is. And we don't get to ask that question. You're sitting there looking surprised. Yeah, you should. That's not wrong. That's not wrong at all. And they're still in shock. And actually, we're still in shock. Because you go through this, and if you're really working through the process with them, everybody's in shock. They go down that path. At this point, to go down the path of why at the point that they're at is a dead end. You just can't go there. When somebody has had that kind of tragedy strike them, to ask why is an absolutely ridiculous thing to do. It doesn't help anybody. It's probably the worst thing you can do. Matter of fact, you just leave before you ask that question. It doesn't help anybody. If we look at how people deal with grief in terms of the 5 stages of grief, which are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, why is not one of them. We can easily identify actually several of them in the interactions that take place. Can't find any traces of denial. It's kind of hard to be there. And I don't believe that he shows any of the overt signs of fist-shaking anger at this point. Although he does get pretty irritated with his friends later on. But while he is not at all happy with any of his circumstances, Job seems quite resolved that the next logical event for him in his life is to be his inevitable demise. He thinks he's going to die. In fact, his words could almost be those of the writer of Ecclesiastes when he speaks in Job 7:1 through 10. Is there not a time of hard service for man on earth? Are not his days also like the days of a hired man, like a servant who earnestly desires the shade, and like a hired man who eagerly looks for his wages? So I have been allotted months of futility, and wearisome nights have been appointed to me. When I lie down, I say, when shall I arise? And the night shall be ended. For I have had my fill of tossing till dawn. My flesh is caked with worms and dust. My skin is cracked and breaks out afresh. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle, and are spent without hope. Oh, remember that my life is a breath. My eye will never see good. The eye of him who sees me will see me no more. While your eyes are upon me, I shall no longer be. As the cloud disappears and vanishes away, so he who goes down to the grave does not come up. He shall never return to his house, nor shall his place know him anymore. He's depressed. He's very depressed. 6:9 through 10 says something very similar. Would that God were willing to crush me, that he would loose his hand and cut me off. But he finishes it with, but this is still my consolation, and I rejoice in my unsparing pain, that I have not concealed or denied the words of the Holy One. He still doesn't turn away from God, even though he thinks he's going to die, and he just assumed to do that. Now, at this point, it'd probably be worth saying something about Job's 3 friends. Job's 3 friends, while they don't show up until the concluding section of chapter 2, they do play a primary role in setting up the plot of the book. They are very important. They're introduced at the end of chapter 2 to give insight into their character and to place them into the overall structure. Now, their role is to provide a foil and a continuing irritation to Job through chapters 3 through 31. Their combined life experience is obviously very great. Quite possibly they're older than Job. Don't know. But from some of the things they say, Eliphaz is obviously the oldest of the three, because you can tell from the fact that he speaks first. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, their ages probably go in that order. And they may, like I said, they may actually be older than Job, or at least his age. So they're older men as well, and they say they're old men. And you find out later on, when Elihu speaks later on, and at the end of the book, that they are all old men, because Elihu calls himself a young man compared to them. So you know that they're all old guys. And Elihu defers to them. They are men of means, and they're men of social stature. They all mean well. They all mean very well. They're trying to be helpful, and I believe they're all God-fearers who come to Job wanting to do the right thing concerning Job. In fact, their first act when they come to Job is simply to sit with him in silence for a full week, as I mentioned earlier. And they appear at first to be just what Job needs. But then Job, remember in Job 3, Job speaks. Job speaks first. And that seems to give them just the opening they need to say what it is that they really wanted to say. And once he had spoken, his friends feel free to say what they have to say. And here is where they are all at fault. They take it on themselves to try to fix, to correct what they perceive to be Job's incorrect view of himself and God, and they try to fix it with what is their faulty view of God. Their view is highly self-protective and flawed as well. And to that end, they very doggedly, every time they speak, they pursue two errant lines of argument. They say everything they say is not wrong. Not at all. There are a lot of things they say that are right, but there are two things that they say every time they speak that are absolutely false. One, they set up a simple syllogism, that is, if then that, or you're over there, so it's if then that. The first argument is that God always punishes the wicked and protects the righteous. They're very consistent on that. This is their song, and they sing it over and over and over. Since Job has suffered such an extreme calamity, they are led to their second argument. Job must have committed some sin that he has not confessed. If he would confess it, God would forgive him and bless him as he was before. To my mind, this must be the ancient predecessor of the health and wealth gospel. That is, if Job would confess and claim God's forgiveness, then God must forgive him and bless him again. But this is really only a sub-theme of the book. It's there all the way through the book, in all that they say. But it's actually it's not the primary theme of the book. It's just there all the way through. There's several sub-themes, as I said before. Their pursuit of these arguments in the face of what the opening chapters make very clear about Job's character put the lie to their limited, self-serving, God-in-a-box theological model. The fact that Job is able to tolerate their incessant badgering and hounding over something he has not done, on top of all that he has already suffered and is suffering, surely must make their presence seem like added torture to him. Instead of being friends, they become his assailants. It's not to say that nothing they say is true, because much much of what they say is true. And it's actually more like they're just not talking to him. He's got his own set of problems at this right here, and they're just talking here. They're talking about something that's not him. Job has not done anything to deserve what has happened to him. And they're saying, they talk about a lot of things that are, some are true and some are not. They just don't relate. And while they're talking to Job, they say, and by the way, Job, you need to confess what you did wrong. And it just drives him nuts all the way through. And it really irritates him. And you can tell it. Now, that's so much for his three friends. You can see that as you read through the book. Now, what about the character of Job himself? Let's look at the opening verse of Job. Jump back. This is a really interesting verse. The first two chapters are, like I said, are very tight. There's an uncommon economy of words in which every detail is purposeful and absolutely no extraneous information is included. Information that we as readers would have liked the author to have included is not there. However, there are some repetitions. Almost nothing is repeated in here except for what I'm going to cover here. Therefore, it's very important to take note of what is repeated. There are some statements. The first verse of Job contains a statement that's repeated 3 times in the first 2 chapters, and within that phrase is a phrase that is used specifically to describe Job's character. It occurs 2 more times in the book. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. It also occurs in Job 1:8, also in 2:3. You can also see it. The word is Tom, and it also occurs in 2:9 and 4:6, different context. It's all about Job, but I just give you a bigger one there so you can see it. It begins with a description of Job. It's interesting. It begins with a description of Job before it tells you anything else about him. At this point, he could have been a shepherd or a sailor or a farmer, for the author chooses to begin with a statement about his character. In fact, the description of Job's immense wealth and high station only comes into play as a backdrop against which to contrast the degree of his fall. This word also, like I said, the first word in here that's translated blameless also occurs in 1:8 and 2:3, where God himself makes the claim of Job, when he draws Satan's attention to his special attention to this special person. Thus, both the narrator and God have this view of Job's character. Now, this word that's translated blameless here is Tom. It's really very difficult to translate into English. English doesn't have a word that really covers this. It's translated variously mature. Sometimes it's translated integrity. And actually, if you really want to know, the words that follow it, that whole phrase goes together. Blameless is also defined by upright, one who feared God and shunned evil. And they all help you to understand what blameless means. Because sometimes blameless is only used by itself. That word is only used by itself of Job. Basically what it means is that he is, best I can figure, let's put it this way, it's probably one of the best short descriptions of Christ-like godliness in the Old Testament. is Tom. And that's a stretch. I realize that, but he's a godly man. He's a man of absolute integrity. He's a man of godliness above all reproach. He is a man of absolute maturity in his faith. And God actually points it out, which is very, very incredible thing. Can you imagine having God point out your character? Say, have you looked at this guy? Have you looked at him? Look at him. He's the best I got. Yeah, okay. But he did in all seriousness, before Satan of all people. So, exactly. So you know what I'm talking about. In addition, he's a man whose motives are pure. His relationship is right with his God. Verses 4 and 5 actually provide an example of the lengths Job would go to in order to make sure that he always fulfilled all his godly responsibilities and duties. To make sure that he always, that is to his family, that is, before God. And actually what he's doing there is he's fulfilling his priestly role for his family. Because in a pre-Mosaic world, the father in the family was the priest. And he is fulfilling that priestly role. Now, we see what the author says about Job. We see what God says about Job. What about what some other people say about Job? Those are also important. What God says about Job should trump everybody else's. But in verse 8, we see what God himself says. It's a repetition of what's in verse 1, where he says it to Satan. And then in chapter 2, verse 3, he says it again. Verse 1:8 is interesting on a lot of different levels. We could dig on some themes on this one, but I'm not going to go there just yet. But God's question focuses. This is the first thing he mentions about Job. It's the first thing the authors mentioned about Job in 1:1. First thing God mentions about Job when he mentions Job before Satan. Satan's response to God, both here and in chapter 2, while not disputing Job's behavior, questions Job's motive for obedience. That is, Satan accuses Job of only giving God his allegiance because God has been good to Job and because it gets Job what he wants and needs. In other words, Job has selfish, utilitarian motives for serving God, is what Satan is saying. If God would simply remove his special treatment from Job, then God and everyone else would find out that Job is really no different from any other man who just tries to manipulate God to get what he wants. When the destruction of Job's children and wealth fails to bring about the desired result, Satan raises the level of accusations by saying that Job is only interested in saving his own skin. And chapter 2:4 makes this very specific. Satan replied to Yahweh and said, "Skin for skin, indeed all that a man has he will give for his life." This is an amazing statement because what he's saying is he accuses Job of not caring for anyone but himself. He says that when we get right down to it, a man will always give up his family and all he has if he must to save his own skin. If his life is threatened, and Satan believes Job's true selfish character will come out. Satan knows that circumstances reveal character. The dialogue between God and Satan in Job 1:7 through 12 and 2:6 are obviously, though, it's interesting, are engineered by God. God's the one that starts the discussion to achieve the outcome that occurs. God's in control of the discussion. Satan's response is never apparently in question. Satan's error is that he doesn't believe God's estimate of Job's character. He believes that Job is no different than anyone else. And he has an obsession to prove otherwise that leads him into the trap that God sets for him. When God points out Job's righteous character to Satan before the convocation of the sons of God, Satan can't help but take that as a challenge to prove God wrong. Therefore, since the interaction between God and Satan is contrived with apparently a predictable outcome, Job's calamity must likewise also be seen as engineered and predictable as well. However, in the first 2 chapters, we find not 2 witnesses to Job's character, but 3, who make specific testimony to his blamelessness. In addition to the author and God, Job's wife also recognize his blameless character, where she says in chapter 2, verse 9, she says, do you still cling to your integrity or blamelessness? And that's where she tells him to curse God and die. She also recognizes it. Further on, at the end of Eliphaz's first speech, he alludes also to Job's integrity. He says, is not your fear of God your confidence, even the integrity of your ways your hope? Eliphaz recognizes that Job clings to his integrity. There are also a couple of other passages. There's one in Job 9, 20 through 22, and also the entire chapter 27 is a speech by Job where he uses his integrity as a basis for that speech. So, where are we here? Yes, Virginia, bad things happen to God's people. It seems that's almost trite at this point to say that after reading the first 2 chapters of Job, yet it's still necessary because a lot of us have fallen into the trap, I think, of at some point of thinking that if a person is good enough, even in a godly sense, that person should be to some degree insulated from calamities. It seems reasonable enough based on the way we think God and the world should work. But of course, that's neither the way God nor the world we live in functions. So we continually find ourselves adjusting our worldview, hopefully to match what is a truer resemblance of the way God's reality is. So, one of the major points of the first 2 chapters is that events are bigger than they seem. Job ends up alone, what appears to be a lonely man on an ash heap. And the circumstances are so much bigger than what he sees. They really are. He seems to be all alone there by himself. And he feels that way. But we're looking at it here, and we see that it's not that way. And yet there's no way he could possibly have known that at the time. So, things are always bigger. Paul was only restating what earlier believers already should have known when he said in Ephesians 6:12, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. We have an audience, people. A big audience. So, what have we looked at? We've looked at the man and his circumstances, a little bit about the character of the man, and we really need to look a little bit at what are some of the issues that are at stake with this as we go through it. There are a lot of issues. I'm sure you all have a lot of questions. So, for all Job's complexity, the answer to its most difficult questions are probably relatively straightforward. The answer to the question why demands a level of knowledge that's impossible for anyone to achieve. That's suggestive of God's challenge in Job, where's that? 38:2. Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? What followed, this is jumping to the end of the book, because we have to deal with this in order to answer the why question, or not answer the why question. What follows, Job, basically what happens all the way through the middle of the book is Job wants God to explain what's going on. He doesn't really couch it in a why, as a why question. He always looks to God as for the one who will address his problem. He sees God as actually the creator of the problem, and he sees God as the solution of the problem. He never turns from God at any point. He's very frustrated with God. But what God does in Job, starting in Job 38, when he appears in the whirlwind, is he speaks. And the first thing he says is, well, first off, before I do this, there are two speeches by God at the end of the book. And the nature of the speeches is different. Job speaks at the end of each one of them. And the two speeches are geared toward, the first one is aimed at addressing the fact that Job doesn't know. And the second one is aimed at addressing the fact that Job doesn't have the power to do what he would have to be able to do. And the reason for those two, the nature of those two speeches is because he can't do those. Therefore, and we'll get to the therefore in a minute, in order to be able to, we'll get there. He asks in 38:2, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? What follows is a litany of questions from God to Job, questions that no man can possibly answer. These are aimed at showing Job's absolute inability to comprehend God's reasoning or the intricate workings behind what God has done. Then, in chapter 40, God will continue with a second challenge to Job, followed by a series of illustrations designed to show God's power and Job's inability to control what God has made. Now, Job, in 40, at the end of the first of God's challenges, 46 through 8, the first one, this is the second of God's speech. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Would you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? Those are the introduction to the two speeches. And actually, this is a little aside on this. Just as the book began with two speeches of God to Satan, it ends with two speeches of God to Job. So he's actually talking directly to Job. The point of this is that it just shows Job's utter unworthiness to challenge God. It's kind of, how dare you question me? It's as if to say, you can't answer you don't have the knowledge to understand. You don't have the ability to do these things, even these things, as far as God is concerned. If you can't do these things or know these things, how can you possibly ask me questions about things that involved in directing the affairs of men. How can you possibly understand those things? I mean, these were knowledge about things. You can't comprehend those. You can't put a fish hook in this big fish's mouth. I mean, and yet you're challenging me. How you don't have the right to ask me a question about something like this. That's where he ends up. And Job understands this perfectly. He understood it after God's first speech. But God didn't let him off that easy. So that's where in 44 through 5, Job just says, "Behold, I'm vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yes, twice, but I will proceed no further." That's when God goes into the whole thing about what he has control over. And then finally in 42, 2 through 6, Job is just utterly shamed. He says, "I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You ask, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge?" That's what he said in 38. God said in 38, "Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand. Things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Listen, please, and let me speak. You said, I will question you, and you shall answer me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I abhor myself, and repent and dust and ashes." Fortunately, he didn't have very far to go. So, what are the real issues here? What are the real issues? Godly people who are living righteously before God may suffer terrible things. In Job's case, it had nothing to do with any sin in his life at all. In fact, God singled him out because he knew he could and would make it through this trial successfully. Of course, no one else knew that at the time, and many people suffered. Fortunately, we can draw added encouragement. From passages like Romans 8:18, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed to us." This verse has to do with our sufferings in Christ. As we see in Job's case, however, he was rewarded with as many children as he lost. Of course, he still lost 10 children. Nobody's denying that. He ended up with twice the goods that he lost. The concept of reward for faithfulness is not just a New Testament concept. But that's another side issue. There are lots of them. When bad things happen to good people, it does not necessarily mean they did something wrong. It was the staunch conclusion of Job's 3 friends that if Job was suffering, then there was some secret sin he had not confessed. Of course, the converse is not necessarily true either. When bad things happen to good people, it does not mean they haven't done anything wrong either. That's a double negative. I know that's hard. It doesn't mean God is testing them in the same way he was testing Job. Maybe they've done something wrong and are simply reaping the consequences for their action. We simply may not be able to know from the outside. We're not in position to be fruit inspectors all the time. It's important for us to note that Job was very specific about what he wanted from his friends as well. That's another side issue that I think is an important issue. They presumed to know what he needed, but they didn't. Job knew what he needed from them, but they didn't listen. Oh, that you would be silent, and it would be your wisdom. Is what he told. I think that's Bildad so far. And back in 6:14 to Eliphaz, he said, "To him who is afflicted, kindness should be shown by his friend, even though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty. My brothers have dealt deceitfully." In other words, he's saying, you came with an agenda to me. This is another side issue. So, on a different note, the intrusion of, this is another one that's probably a big red flag for most people. On a different note, the intrusion of a spiritual element into the story brings both meaning and chaos into Job's predicament. It raises a host of issues for the reader while presenting few answers to the questions that it invites. We are ushered into the middle of the third act of a play with very little indication of what has gone on before it. We think we know who the characters are, but we don't know why they're there. We don't know what has brought about this gathering of the sons of God in 1:6. And again in chapter 2, verse 1. And especially why Satan is present on both occasions. God's selection of Job is clearly intentional. And Satan is clearly ignorant of what the ultimate outcome of his efforts will be. God is obviously aware of what Satan will seek to do to Job, and clearly gives him direct, specific permission to wreak havoc on Job's life. Destruction that brings about much sadness. An odd comment is found in Job 2:3 while God is speaking with Satan the second time. While God is not the direct cause of Job's suffering in chapter 1, nevertheless, he does not avoid taking full responsibility for it. The last word of this verse is translated undeservedly. It takes on the notion here of without cause. That's what the New King James translates it, and several others. This makes perfect sense in the larger context, since God has twice stated that Job is blameless. He hasn't done anything specifically to deserve what God is allowing to happen to him. This is important, especially in light of the accusations that are thrown against Job by his friends throughout chapters 4 through 25, when they repeatedly insist that he has somehow brought this calamity on himself due to some unconfessed sin. According to this statement here in chapter 2, verse 3, God has no problem owning his own complicity in the circumstances that befell Job. These events were orchestrated for a particular purpose and for individuals, and individuals were completely unaware of the larger spiritual dimension involved in the sordid nastiness that was happening around them. To them, it simply seemed that their entire world had fallen apart. They were alone and they had nothing left. However, it is worth noting, and this is important, that nowhere in the book does Job ever look anywhere else but to God as a possible source of relief or salvation from his circumstances, even though Job frequently states that he is convinced that God is the author of his misfortune. This one from Job 12:9 will serve to illustrate that. Job is aware that Yahweh himself has sanctioned what has happened to him because nothing happens without his knowledge or permission. His theology is correct. On the other hand, he does have a problem, of course, with the application of it to his own life. So his question remains as to who is responsible. The question remains as to who is responsible for the bad things that happened to Job. Is it God or Satan? Of course, Satan is the immediate cause, However, there's no way to avoid saying that God himself is the ultimate cause. There is ample evidence to show that God engineered this entire situation from beginning to end to accomplish a purpose greater than Satan, Job, or anyone else who witnessed these events could have imagined. Job's lonely tragedy in life on the ash heap has influenced and encouraged believers for thousands of years. On those 2 occasions in heaven, if Satan had known what the outcome of his efforts would be, he might have stayed silent when God pointed out Job's godly character to him. The implication of saying that God is the ultimate cause only makes sense in the context of a worldview that also says that we are not our own, that we cannot comprehend all that our loving God is doing around us, and that we are ultimately his to do with as he pleases. In the end, God forces Job to admit that his ability to understand life events is completely inadequate to comprehend the complexity of what is happening even in his small environment, much less in the larger world around him. He must trust God based on what he knows to be true about him. Satan suggests that man worships God for selfish, self-promoting reasons in Job 1, 9 through 11. Therefore, according to Satan, no worship is truly voluntary. Man's adoration is not willing, but subverted by God. According to this logic, it is inevitable that men will crumble when they undergo undeserved suffering. Satan twice predicted that Job would deny God. Job's attitude did, in fact, appear to deteriorate through the book. However, he never actually denied his faith and stopped short of turning away from God. No one questions that Job wanted God to show a better side of himself. And in Job 13:15, he said, "Though he slay me, I will hope in him." Job continually, all the way through the book, he sought to engage God. He always saw God as the one who would vindicate him. So, what is the attitude that adequately rationalizes what we know about our loving God with what we see happening in this book? It's summed up in the image, I think, in the image of the potter and the clay in Isaiah, where he says, "You turn things around. Shall the potter be considered as equal with the clay? What is made should say to its maker, he did not make me. Or what is formed, say to him who formed it, he has no understanding." And again, in Isaiah 45:9, "Woe to the one who quarrels with his maker, an earthenware vessel among the vessels of earth. Will the clay say to the potter, what are you doing? Or the thing you are making say, he has no hands." In Isaiah 64:8, again, "But now, O Lord, you are our Father, we are the clay, and you are potter, and all of us are the work of your hand." And Paul picks it up in Romans 9:20 through 21 when he says, "Or does not the potter have a right over the clay to make from the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for common use? Or does not the potter have a right over the clay to make from the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for common use?" One of the first mistakes anyone can make in studying Job is to conclude that it's just a book about suffering. The circumstance in which the story takes place is suffering. But that's not what the book is about. The practical subject is really no different than the subject of many other biblical character studies in the Old Testament. It's a study of how faith works in a believer's life as life happens. This person is one of the most mature believers we could ever hope to meet in either testaments, and he went through a particularly awful experience. We have a very condensed yet vivid account of his afflictions and have a privileged glimpse, I think, into a little of how he and those around him dealt with those conditions. And if you guys have something you want to contribute or questions, I would really like to open it up right now. Robbie.
First of all, when somebody asks a question, please repeat it so we get it on the sound.
I will do that.
My question is, what's your summary view of Elihu's role in the book?
Elihu is an interesting person. What's my summary view? Thank you. Of Elihu's role. See there, I blew it right off the bat. Elihu is an interesting person. He actually is sort of a lead-in. He's sort of God's front man, almost. He says a lot of things that God ends up saying in a much fuller sense. It seems like a much more condensed, fuller sense. He seems to be almost kind of long-winded. He doesn't say anything wrong. His view of God is correct in every sense. And it's interesting that Job doesn't have anything to say after Elihu, and God just speaks right after Elihu. He's a corrective to the other three, is what he is. After the other three, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar speak, Elihu, this man who's half their age, speaks and corrects them. He apologizes profusely before he does. He says, I couldn't say anything. He obviously has come into this whole scene after it's already started. But he just apologizes profusely because he says, I'm younger than you guys, and I know more than you do about God. And he's right. And he says things that are actually in keeping with the things that God says about himself in 38 through 42. And it's just, so he's actually what I would consider a bridge. But he's obviously corrective to the other ones, but I doubt they listen to him. It doesn't say anything about Job's response to him because Job doesn't give a response to him. So beyond that, I'm not really sure. He tends to be a little maybe a little long-winded, but he says things that are true. So, anybody else? Was that enough?
Hey, Mike.
Okay.
You knew I was going to ask.
I knew you were going to say something. I just didn't know what.
Absolutely. Every once in a while, we run across a Job in ministry. Not the perfect match, but guys who are close for whatever reason. Can you give us one or two things that you would want to inform a Job? Maybe one or two things that you would say to this person, here's where you want to be in your relationship with God. Here's how to interact with God now that you're in the middle of this tragedy. And maybe one or two don't go there. You might not want to go in this direction if there are any in the book of Job that you see.
That's a pretty broad question. Yeah, it really depends on the person.
Sure.
It really does. It depends on the person and what they're dealing with. What? I don't know if I can.
Just tell us what you would say to someone who is a Job.
What would I say to a person who is a Job? If they have that, if a person has Job's maturity, there's really not a lot that you can say to them except be with them. Job said what he wanted. He wanted those guys to be with him. He didn't need a lot of instruction. He needed time to work through things. And he was pretty clear on that. He was not in danger of jumping off, losing his face or jumping off the wagon at all, I don't think. He said a lot of outlandish things, but that's okay. He's going to go around the circle and come back around. And he did. Because it was a rough time. If the person has that kind of maturity, I don't think you're in danger of losing him, but he does need people to be with him. These people were actually pushing him away by trying to be a corrective. They tried to deal with what he was actually saying, and they weren't doing it. That's what it was. He said cursed is the day that I was born, and may that day had never have been on the calendar, kind of thing. Just erase it. That's the way he was feeling. Feelings are feelings. Don't try to say. Don't say that. No, he wasn't doing that. It depends on the person. If the person doesn't know how to deal with it, if the person is actually saying God shouldn't do this, and if a person's not a mature enough person is going to lose their faith over this, then you obviously have to at least tell them who God is. I think you have to bring them up to speed, because then they're going to. It depends on the person. Job was the most mature person in the world spiritually. He was obviously special. He was picked for this, hand chosen. Other people have these things happen who aren't in that exact position, and things like this happen to them, and it's like a freight train ran over them, and they don't recover quite so well. Those people need a lot of special attention, so long-term projects. How do you deal with those people?
From the book of Job, it's a good place to start.
You can start. You have to love those people.
Absolutely. And I don't care how mature they are, I'm still going to encourage them.
You have to encourage. You have to love those people. That's the first thing you have to do.
Absolutely.
I had a question. One over here. Yes, sir. And then I'll come back.
Do you think Job ever had any indication what was going on in the throne room above?
Well, eventually somebody did.
Repeat the question.
Did Job ever have any? Thank you, Ron. Did Job ever have any indication of what was going on in the throne room? Not till after the book was done. Not till sometime after chapter 41. No, not at all. He's clueless. And it's pretty obvious from the statements that are made all the way through it. When all that part was revealed, nobody knows. Nobody even knows who wrote this book or when it was written or anything, except got some indications it's old. But no, while it's going on, not at all. This was all put together later. Yes, sir.
You raise a difficult question with God sanctioning this whole thing, where we believe or know that God is not the author of sin. How do we reconcile these things, or can you even reconcile that?
Raise a difficult question with God, what did you say, condoning or sanctioning these things. That is hard. That's right. It is very difficult, because God is not the author of sin. And this is a question that's actually bigger than the book of Job. And here you see it played out graphically. I mean, you really do. Because God actually pointed it out, bragged on this righteous man, and let Satan do what he did. And he made it up to Job. And the end of the book, it really kind of comes back to why. And it comes back to what God does at the end of the book. And he says, if I can put it in a nutshell, the answer to the question is bigger than what you can understand. It really comes back to, you have to look at me. What do you know about me? Do you trust me? It really does. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. And for the person that decides they're going to jump off the wagon, that's really what it comes down to. They don't trust. They don't know enough about God to trust Him when these things happen. And that's why I think it's really significant, I think, that this book is early. Because if this is what you have as one of the early books of Scripture, then this is what you have as a foundation for other scriptures. Then you have a basis of trust, and this is a worldview. This is a worldview shaping book. It really is, because now you know that there are certain things that you can know, and there are certain things that you can't know. Now, am I going to trust, or am I not going to trust? That there are just certain things I can't possibly go there. My brain will not wrap around them. I'm in too small a box in order to see all this. I can't see what's on the other side of town from here because I'm standing in this room. So what do you mean I don't know what's going on over there? How dare God say I can't know what's going on the other side of town? It's that kind of question. It's silly when you get down to it. But that's really what God is saying. You can't do it because you're not me. But you don't want to tell somebody it's silly, but,
They have to figure it out.
yeah, ultimately, I think you have to get to a person to that level, a position where they're comfortable with that. And that's where we have to go, too.
What do you think that the Job-style instances in our life are the ones that grow us closer to God as the mountaintop experiences? Aren't they more important in maturing in God, experiencing trouble and seeing God bring us through it, more important than the times we're not struggling?
Are the Job-type experiences in our life more important than the mountaintop experiences are the ones when we're not struggling? I'd hesitate to say that they're more important. I will definitely say that they are very important. They can be some of the most significant experiences in our lives. They can be life-changing, absolutely, but I won't say that they're one's more important than the other. All are important. What God does is important in our life, but those things can definitely, as far as rapid change goes, definitely. One more. Yes, sir.
At the end of the book, God basically doubled Job's wealth back to him.
That's right.
Now, as we as believers in this dispensation, when we go through suffering, should we expect for God to, let's say, reward us also? Or is Job somewhat of the exception? Because from my understanding, it seems like we're in the dispensation of suffering as far as compared to the Old Testament believers, in which it was more prosperity as the nation of Israel went into the land, conquered the land, and they were rewarded.
Should we expect, let me see if I understand this. Should we
expect to be rewarded for going through suffering in this particular dispensation?
should we expect to be rewarded for going through suffering in this particular dispensation?
Yes. Or was Job the exception?
Was Job the exception? Well, Job was not he wasn't in the Mosaic dispensation. He was prior to it.
Right.
But as far as rewards go, we get rewarded in heaven when we go to be with Him. So God can choose to reward us however He wants. He could give us rewards now, or He could give them rewards later. But our primary, He promises to reward us in the kingdom. So that's where we're looking to build them up. So, but if He wants to give us something now, that's fine too. But I don't think that's what we're supposed to count on.
No. I was just wondering.
I'm not sure exactly how to go after that one. Do you need this?